Welcome to Starbound's Fantasy channel. My name is I Am Duck, and I'll be your narrator today. Please check to see if you've subscribed to the channel. It's 100% free and just allows our stories to pop up on your feed more often. The mountain had been bleeding rust for 300 years, and Grucker was finally going to find out why. She crouched at the edge of what had once been a battlefield, her scarred knuckles wrapped around the haft of her favorite club, a thing of beauty called Skull Splitter that had earned its name through honest work. Around her, a dozen goblin scavengers picked through the detritus of some ancient war like carrion birds with opposable thumbs.
Chief!
Zeg's reedy voice cut through the morning air. The scrawniest goblin in the tribe came scrambling over a pile of corroded armor, his ridiculous fake spectacles, salvaged from some long-dead scholar, sliding down his warty nose.
Chief! Oh, you gotta see this!
Grucker sighed. Zeg found something worth shouting about roughly every 10 minutes. Last week it had been a magical sword that turned out to be a very tarnished butter knife. If it's another spoon, Zeg, I'm using your head for drum practice.
No, look!
He thrust a piece of parchment at her, yellow with age but somehow still intact. Strange symbols marched across it in orderly rows. Not the chaotic scroll of goblin writing, but something precise, musical.
It's covered in these little dots and squiggles! Very organized squiggles.
Grucker squinted at the parchment. She could read, barely, but this wasn't any language she recognized. Looks like bird droppings to me.
That's what I thought, but look where I found it!
Zeg gestured wildly toward a section of the mountainside where the rust bleeding had worn away centuries of accumulated dirt. There, carved into the living rock itself, was the mouth of a tunnel. Ancient symbols flanked the entrance, the same organized squiggles that decorated the parchment. Could be a tomb, muttered Grucker. Interest finally peaked. Tombs meant treasure. Treasure meant she could afford better armor for her crew. Maybe even commission a proper war banner instead of the patched-together rag they currently fought under. Could be cursed, offered Nock, her second in command, a goblin so extensively tattooed that finding his original skin color had become something of a philosophical question.
Could be both,
said Zeg cheerfully.
Wanna find out?
20 minutes later, they stood before a pair of bronze doors that had somehow resisted 3 centuries of mountain weather. The metal gleamed as if it had been polished yesterday, and more of those peculiar symbols wound around the frame in spiraling patterns. Right, said Grucker, hefting Skull Splitter. Stand back, I'll...
Wait!
Zeg pressed his ear against the door.
I think there's something behind here. Something big.
Course there is. That's why we're breaking in.
No, I mean...
He frowned, pushing his fake spectacles up his nose.
It's like it's waiting for something.
Grucker had survived 15 years as a goblin war chief by thrusting her instincts, and right now her instincts were telling her that Zeg might actually be onto something. She'd also survived by knowing when to ignore instincts in favor of immediate proof. She raised Skull Splitter and brought it down on the bronze with every ounce of her considerable strength. The impact rang out like a bell, a clear, pure note that seemed to hang in the air far longer than physics should have allowed. The sound struck the mountain and came bouncing back, harmonizing with itself in ways that made Grucker's teeth itch. Then the doors began to open. Not creak open or groan open or reluctantly swing open the way normal doors did when you hit them with a club. They opened like they'd been waiting 3 centuries for exactly that note, flowing apart with silent precision until a corridor stretched before them, lit by some impossible source that turned the air itself into pale golden honey.
Well,
said Zeg, adjusting his spectacles.
That's new.
The corridor beyond was a thing of beauty and terror in equal measure. The walls were lined with alcoves, each containing what appeared to be a musical instrument, but instruments like none of them had ever seen. Horns twisted into impossible spirals, drums stretched with what looked like dragon hide, and things that might have been flutes if flutes were designed by madmen with a deep understanding of acoustics.
Humans?
Spat Nock, recognizing the craftsmanship.
Always did like their pretty trinkets.
Pretty trinkets that might be worth something, Grucker reminded him. Spread out, look for anything valuable, and try not to touch anything that looks like it might explode. They'd made it perhaps 50 feet down the corridor when Zeg, inevitably, touched something that looked like it might explode. It was a brass horn, coiled like a sleeping serpent, and mounted on the wall at goblin eye level. Zeg had been examining the strange writing etched along its length when his elbow bumped against what turned out to be a very sensitive trigger mechanism. The sound that emerged wasn't the harsh blast one might expect from a military instrument. Instead, it was a melody, complex, layered, and absolutely beautiful in a way that made Grucker's warrior heart clench with unexpected emotion. The notes seemed to speak of home and hearth, of fields under starlight, of everything worth fighting for, and everyone worth dying beside. It was also, as they quickly discovered, a key. Doors opened throughout the corridor, not violently, but with the same patient precision as the entrance. From each alcove stepped figures in tarnished armor, their faces hidden behind helms that had once been polished to mirror brightness. They moved with military precision, forming ranks with an efficiency that would have impressed even Grucker. The only problem was that they were all quite thoroughly dead.
Skeletons,
observed Nock helpfully.
Armored skeletons!
Added Zag, his voice climbing toward the register normally reserved for religious experiences or complete panic. Armored skeletons with weapons, finished Grucker, noting the swords and spears that had materialized in bony hands with disturbing synchronization. The figure at the front of the formation, taller than the others, with a plume of faded scarlet adorning his helm, raised one gauntleted hand. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, even by death itself. Identify yourselves, trespassers. Have you come to join the final choir? Or shall we add your bones to our collection? Grucker stepped forward, because that's what war chiefs did. They stepped forward when everyone else wanted to step back. Name's Grucker. These are my lads. We're here for salvage, not trouble. The skeletal general tilted his head, and Grucker could somehow sense amusement behind the empty eye sockets of his helm. Salvage? You've wandered into the conservatory of the final choir, little goblin. The only thing you'll salvage here is perhaps a shred of dignity, if you prove worthy of our teachings.
Teachings?
Zeg piped up, curiosity overriding terror in the way it always did.
What kind of teachings?
The kind that turned the tide of Thornvale, the general replied, pride warming his spectral voice. The kind that held the line at Queensbridge for 7 days and 7 nights. The kind that... He paused, studying them more carefully. But you wouldn't understand. Goblins fight with tooth and claw, with rage and chaos. You know nothing of harmony, nothing of discipline. Something hot and dangerous flared in Grucker's chest. She'd been insulted by experts, pit fighters, and warlords and orc chieftains who would crush her skull between their fingers. But this dead human, this relic of a failed civilization, dared to lecture her about fighting. Listen here, bone boy, she growled, taking another step forward. My lads and I have fought through the screaming hills. We've held the pass at Grimjaw Canyon against a full orc warband. You've brawled, the general interrupted, somehow managing to sound bored despite lacking vocal cords. You've engaged in crude violence with no thought for strategy, no consideration for your fellow warriors, no understanding of the greater symphony of battle. You're not soldiers. You're brutish chaos and scrappy luck. The insult hung in the air like a challenge. Around the corridor, the other skeletal warriors stood at perfect attention, waiting for orders that might or might not come. Grucker felt her crew tense beside her, hands drifting toward weapons. Then Zeg, bless his scrawny hide, asked exactly the right question.
What's the greater symphony of battle?
The general's helm turned toward him, and for a moment the corridor fell silent except for the distant sound of wind through mountain pass. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different quality, not the bark of command, but the patient tone of a teacher who had found an unexpected student. Everything is rhythm, little tinkerer. The march of feet, the clash of steel, the beating of hearts in the moment before the charge. Humans learnt long ago that an army which moves as one fights as one. We turned warfare into art, and art into victory. He gestured toward the instruments lining the walls. These are not decorations. These are weapons, tools of coordination and morale, precision and timing. The horn your friend sounded, that was our morning call, the song that woke the garrison and prepared them for the day's battles. Each note carries meaning, each rhythm a command. Commands? Grucker found herself interested despite her irritation. What kind of commands? Simple ones at first. March tempo, battle pace, the signal to form ranks, to charge, to retreat in good order. The general's voice grew wistful. Humans used music to inspire their knights and unify their armies. Music was our code for conduct. The general sighed with nostalgia. But the final choir knew greater songs. We could turn a rout into a rally with a single verse. We could coordinate cavalry charges across a battlefield with nothing but drum cadence. We made music from warfare and warfare from music. Prove it, said Grucker. The general went very still. I beg your pardon. You heard me. Prove it. Show us this great human discipline you're so proud of. Because from where I'm standing, all I see is a bunch of dead soldiers, hiding in a hole in the ground. For a long moment, the only sound in the corridor was the distant drip of water on stone. Then the general began to laugh, a sound like winter wind through bare branches, but somehow warm. Oh, little goblin, you have no idea what you're asking for. He raised his sword, and the blade caught the golden light like captured starfire. Very well, but know this. The symphony of fire sleeps deeper in these halls. If you prove unworthy of the final choir's legacy, it will wake. And when it wakes... He let the threat hang unfinished, then brought his sword down in a sharp salute. The motion was precise, elegant, and absolutely beautiful in its economy of movement. Only the most tuned soldiers will survive. Grucker had fought in gladiator pits, where the sand was soaked with the blood of 100 champions. She'd led cavalry charges against fortified positions and lived to tell the tale. She'd once arm-wrestled a hill giant to a draw and only cheated a little bit. None of it had prepared her for trying to teach goblins how to march in time. Left, right, or... General Vorik's voice echoed through the training chamber, somehow managing to sound exasperated despite being produced by a skeleton who technically didn't have lungs. No, Nook, you're rather left. Zeg, you're dragging behind. This is supposed to be a march, not a funeral procession. The skeletal general had introduced himself properly once it became clear they were serious about learning. General Marcus Varick, 3rd Battalion of the Royal Engineers, last commander of the final choir, and, as he put it with grim humor, current instructor of the most hopeless recruits in the history of military education.
This is ridiculous,
panted Nock, sweat streaming down his tattooed face as he tried to keep pace with the goblin next to him.
We're fighters, not dancers.
Fighting is dancing. Varick snapped back. It's the dance of death. And if you can't keep the rhythm, you'll be dancing to someone else's tune, again, from the top. They'd been at it for 3 hours. 3 hours of stumbling over their own feet, bumping into each other, and discovering that synchronized movement was apparently the most difficult thing in the known universe. But slowly, painfully, incrementally, they were getting better. Grucker wiped sweat from her brow and caught herself nodding along to the cadence. There was something hypnotic about it, something that spoke to a part of her warrior's heart she'd never recognized before. The steady beat, the shared rhythm, the way her crew was beginning to move as a single organism instead of a collection of individuals.
Chief!
Zeg appeared at her elbow, clutching one of the strange spiral horns from the wall displays.
I think I figured something out.
She glanced at the instruments in his hands. Please tell me you didn't break it.
No. Well, maybe a little. But look!
He pointed at the symbols etched along the horn's length.
These aren't just decorations. They're instructions. Like a recipe, but for sound.
Grucker squinted at the markings. They still looked like organized bird droppings to her, but Zeg had always been clever with patterns and mechanisms. What kind of instructions? Watch! Zeg raised the horn to his lips and blew a simple sequence of notes. Nothing fancy, just a basic melody that somehow made Grucker's spine straighten and her feet want to move. Around the training chamber, the goblin marchers suddenly snapped into perfect formation. Not stumbling, not dragging, but moving with the precision of clockwork soldiers. Even Nock, who'd been complaining about the whole enterprise since they started, fell into step with military bearing. Well, I'll be damned, breathed Varick. The boy's a natural. What did you do? Grucker demanded. Zeg lowered the horn, grinning like he'd just discovered fire.
It's all coded, Chief. The music, these symbols. They're like written instructions for different battle maneuvers. This sequence means form ranks. That one over there probably means advance at double time. And this complex bit here,
He pointed to a particularly elaborate section of notation.
I think this one calls up reinforcements.
Reinforcements?
Should we test it?
Zeg asked, already raising the horn again. Absolutely not, said Varick firmly. That particular call awakens their reserve guard. They've been sleeping for 3 centuries, and they're likely to be irritable. But Zeg, being Zeg, had already started playing. The melody that emerged was different from the simple marching cadence, richer, more complex, with harmonies that seemed to twist through the air like living things. It spoke of duty and honor, of warriors who had sworn oaths that death itself could not break. From deep in the mountain came an answering sound, the tread of many feet, moving in perfect synchronization. "Oh, wonderful," muttered Varric. "Now we're all going to die." But when the reserve guard emerged from the shadows of the deeper tunnels, they didn't attack. Instead, they formed ranks behind Varric with the same precise discipline as the original skeletons, their ancient armor gleaming in the golden light. "Huh," said Grucker. "That's handy." "It's more than handy," Varric replied, sounding almost proud. "It's what made us human, not our strength. We were never the strongest, not our magic, we barely had any, but our ability to work together, to move as one, to turn individual weakness into collective strength. That is our gift." Grucker found herself nodding. She'd seen it in her own crew over the past few hours, the way they'd gone from a collection of brawlers to something approaching a real unit. There was power in it, a kind of strength she'd never considered before. "Right then," she said, hefting Skull Splitter. "What else can you teach us?" The next few hours passed in a blur of instruction, practice, and gradual revelation. Varric taught them battle signals embedded in drum patterns, tactical formations encoded in song lyrics, and coordination techniques that turned chaotic goblin aggression into something approaching military precision. Zeg proved to have an almost supernatural gift for the musical side of things, quickly mastering instruments that had taken human soldiers months to learn. More importantly, he began to understand the deeper principles, the way rhythm could synchronize heartbeats, how certain frequencies could boost morale or spread fear, why humans had turned music into a weapon of war.
"It's not just about the sound,"
he explained to Grucker during a brief rest.
"It's about connection. When we're all moving to the same beat, we're not separate fighters anymore. We're part of something bigger."
"The goblins are learning faster than I expected," Varric admitted quietly. "They have good instincts, even if their technique needs work. Your Zeg especially. He's grasping concepts that took my best recruits weeks to understand." Grucker felt a surge of pride. Always said he was clever. Clever, yes. But more than that, he understands the heart of what we were trying to do. Music isn't just art, it's technology, a way of transmitting complex information instantly across a battlefield. A method of coordinating attacks without shouting orders that the enemy can hear. A tool for... He stopped mid-sentence, his skeletal head tilting as if listening to something beyond normal hearing. "What is it?" Grucker asked. "Footsteps," Varric said grimly. "Many footsteps, and they're not keeping time." From somewhere above them came the sound of voices, harsh, argumentative, distinctly goblin. Voices engaged in the kind of loud disagreement that usually preceded violence. "Rival warband," Grucker growled, recognizing the signs. "They must have followed our trail." "How many?" asked Varric. Grucker listened carefully to the chaos echoing down from the entrance. "Sounds like Throg's crew. Maybe 30 warriors, all veterans. They're not here for the same reasons we are. Meaning they don't give a damn about human music or military discipline. They're here to loot, kill, and burn everything they can't carry." She hefted Skull Splitter, feeling the familiar weight settle into her hands. "Looks like we're about to find out how much we've learnt." Varric nodded slowly. "There's something else you should know. The deeper chambers of this complex contain the symphony of fire. A final defensive measure, designed to protect the most sacred artifacts of the final choir. If these raiders penetrate too far into the mountain, it'll wake up. It'll wake up. And when it does, everything in these tunnels will burn. Everything. Above them, the voices grew louder, closer. Grucker could make out individual words now. Threats, boasts, the usual pre-battle posturing that goblins use to work themselves into a proper fighting frenzy. Right then, she said, turning to address her crew. Listen up, lads. We've got company coming, and they're not the friendly sort. Time to see if all this marching and music making was worth the effort. Zeg clutched his borrowed horn like a talisman.
What do we do, Chief?
Grucker grinned, feeling the old familiar fire kindling in her chest. But this time, it was different. Controlled, focused, part of something larger than her own personal bloodlust. We show them what the final choir was really about, she said. We give them a concert they'll never forget. The first of Throg's raiders appeared at the entrance to the training chamber, just as Grucker raised Skull Splitter in the signal Varric had taught her. Behind her, her crew fell into formation with precision that would have made their ancestors weep with pride. And for the first time in 3 centuries, the final choir prepared to sing again. Deep in the mountain's heart, mechanisms that had slept for centuries began to stir. Pipes groaned as ancient furnaces ignited. Gears clicked and whirred as clockwork orchestras prepared for their grand finale. And through it all, a sound like the breathing of some vast, musical dragon echoed through the corridors of the crypt. The symphony of fire was waking up, and it sounded like the end of the world tuning its instruments.
Well,
said Zeg, adjusting his spectacles as the floor vibrated beneath their feet.
this is less than ideal.
Above them, Throg's raiders had smashed through the outer defenses with the subtlety of a landslide. They'd ignored the musical instruments, dismissed the skeletal gods as dusty old bones, and proceeded to trigger every single trap, alarm, and defensive mechanism in the complex through sheer, bloody-minded determination to loot everything in sight. Idiots, Grucker muttered, listening to the chaos echoing down from the upper levels. Don't they realize what they're doing? Goblins rarely do, Varric observed dryly. Present company excluded, of course, for the most part. The general had led them deep into the mountain, past chambers filled with instruments that defied descriptions, and training grounds where the echoes of ancient battles still seemed to linger in the air. Now they stood at the entrance to the final chamber, a vast space that opened before them like the inside of some impossible cathedral. The symphony of fire occupied the center of the chamber, like a mechanical god. It was part organ, part siege engine, and part work of art. A towering construction of brass and steel that rose from floor to ceiling in spiraling tiers. Hundreds of pipes jutted from its sides at impossible angles, while keyboards and percussion arrays were built into its base. Steam hissed from vents along its flanks, and the air round it shimmered with heat distortions.
Beautiful,
breathed Zeg.
Terrifying, but beautiful.
It was meant to be both, Varric replied. The final choir's last resort. A weapon that could level a city or inspire an army, depending on who was playing it and what song they chose. And it's waking up because those idiots upstairs can't tell the difference between a door and a trap trigger, Grucker said grimly. As if summoned by her words, the first of Throg's raiders burst into the chamber. They were bigger than Grucker's crew, scarred and brutal-looking even by goblin standards, armed with the kind of weapons that prioritized intimidation over practicality.
Well, well,
called their leader, a massive goblin with file teeth and arms like tree trunks.
if it isn't little Graka and her pet weaklings, come to steal our treasure, have you?
Your treasure. Grucker stepped forward, skull splitter balanced easily in her hands. Throg, you bloated sack of ambition. This mountain was ours first. We opened it. We explored it. We earned what's here. Throg laughed, a sound like boulders rolling down a cliff.
Earned! You always were too soft, Graka. Treasure belongs to whoever's strong enough to take it. And right now...
He gestured to his 30 warriors, who spread out in a rough semicircle around the chamber's entrance.
That's us.
Is it, though? The voice that spoke wasn't Grucker's, or Throg's, or any of the other goblins present. It was Varric, stepping forward with the kind of casual authority that made even veteran raiders take notice.
Who's the skeleton?
Throg demanded, squinting at the general's ancient armor.
Someone who's forgotten more about warfare than you'll ever know,
Varric replied coolly.
Tell me, Throg of the Iron Teeth, are you familiar with the concept of tactical disadvantage?
Throg spat.
I'm familiar with the concept of dead things, shutting up before I make them deader.
Fascinating. Because from where I stand, you've just brought 30 warriors into a confined space with limited exits, no knowledge of the terrain, and no understanding of the weapon systems currently activating around you. Varric gestured casually toward the symphony of fire, which was glowing brighter as its ancient mechanisms came fully online. In military terms, we call that catastrophically stupid.
We call it target practice,
snarled Throg, raising his weapon, a massive club studded with iron spikes. That's when Zeg started to play. The melody that emerged from his horn was unlike anything he'd attempted before. Complex, layered, building from a single foundation into something that seemed to fill every corner of the vast chamber. It wasn't just music, it was architecture made of sound, a structure that lifted the spirit and demanded attention from every living thing within hearing. Around the chamber, the skeletal warriors of the final choir began to move. Not the shambling shuffle of the common undead, but the precise coordinated movement of professional soldiers who had drilled together for years. They flowed into formation with practiced ease, creating a defensive line that turned Throg's numerical advantage into a liability.
Neat trick,
Throg admitted, but his tone suggested he wasn't impressed.
Let's see how well bones fight.
He charged forward with a roar, his massive club whistling through the air toward Grucker's head. She met him halfway, skull splitter intercepting his blow with a clang that rang throughout the chamber. And that's when the real battle began. It wasn't the chaotic free-for-all that most goblin conflicts devolved into. This was something else entirely. A coordinated engagement where every move had purpose, every action served the larger strategy. Grucker's crew moved like the disciplined unit they trained to become, supporting each other, maintaining formation, fighting with a precision that left Throg's raiders struggling to adapt. Zeg's horn provided the soundtrack, weaving melodies that seemed to anticipate the flow of combat. When Grucker needed to press an advantage, the music swelled to inspire greater aggression. When a line needed to hold, The rhythm steadied into an unbreakable foundation of sound. But the symphony of fire was still waking up, and its presence filled the chamber with increasing heat and pressure. Pipes began to whistle as steam built up in the ancient machinery. The floor vibrated with mechanical rhythms that made it difficult to maintain footing. "Zeg!" Grucker called out during a brief lull in the fighting. "Can you control that thing?"
"I don't know,"
he called back, ducking a wild swing from one of Throg's warriors.
"but I can try."
He began working his way toward the symphony, playing as he moved, using his music to coordinate the defensive effort, while simultaneously attempting to establish some kind of connection with the massive instrument. The skeletal warriors moved to protect him, forming a corridor through the chaos of battle. Throg, seeing his prize slipping away, roared in fury and began cutting his way through friend and foe alike in his determination to reach the symphony first. "You want to play music?" he bellowed, blood streaming from a dozen minor wounds. "I'll show you music." He reached the symphony's base and began hammering at its keyboards with his massive fists, producing a discordant cacophony that made everyone in the chamber wince. The ancient instrument responded by belching gouts of superheated steam and ratcheting its mechanical voice up to truly dangerous levels.
"Stop!"
Zeg shouted.
"You're going to!"
The symphony of fire erupted. What followed was less a song than a force of nature. Sound became solid. Heat became visible, and the line between music and destruction disappeared entirely. The chamber filled with a roar that seemed to come from the mountain itself, while jets of flame shot from the instrument's pipes in patterns that would have been beautiful if they weren't so utterly lethal. Throg's warriors scattered, screaming as the floor beneath their feet began to glow with radiant heat. Some fled toward the entrance, only to find their escape route blocked by fallen stone. Others pressed themselves against the walls, seeking any shelter from the infernal orchestra that now dominated the chamber. But Zeg, somehow, had found the rhythm. Standing at the symphony's base, his small form dwarfed by the mechanical giant, he played his horn in counterpoint to the instrument's chaotic voice, not fighting it, but joining with it, adding structure to its wild song. The flames began to follow patterns, the steam vented in controlled bursts, and slowly, impossibly, the symphony's voice modulated from destructive cacophony into something approaching music. "That's it!" Varric called out, his skeletal voice somehow carrying over the din. "Don't fight it! Conduct it! Make it sing your song." And Zeg did, with courage that would have impressed the bravest human warrior. He stepped forward and placed his hands on the symphony's primary keyboard. The instrument responded like a warhorse recognizing its rider, its voice shifting from chaos to harmony as Zeg began to play the greatest song of his life. The melody that emerged was everything the final choir had ever been, noble and fierce, disciplined yet passionate, beautiful in a way that transcended species or circumstance. It spoke of warriors who had sworn oaths that death could not break, of causes worth dying for, and friends worth living beside. Under its influence, the chamber transformed. The scattered riders found themselves moving in unconscious rhythm, their aggression fading as the music worked its ancient magic. Even Throg, his crude features slack with wonder, lowered his weapon and stood transfixed. But it was Grucker who understood what needed to happen next. Moving with the steady tread of a soldier on parade, she walked to where Throg stood motionless in the symphony's thrall. Skull's splitter hung loose in her grip, not abandoned, but momentarily unnecessary. You hear it, don't you? She said quietly. Throg nodded slowly, his file teeth gleaming in the symphony's light. What is it? It's what we could be, Grucker replied. All of us. Not just raiders scratching for scraps, but something more. Something worth being. She gestured to her crew, still maintaining formation despite the chaos around them. Look at them, Throg. Really look. They're not the same goblins who walked into this mountain. They're better. Stronger. Not because they've learned to fight. They already knew that. But because they've learned to fight together. The symphony song reached a crescendo, and for a moment the entire chamber seemed to hold its breath. Then slowly, the music began to fade as Zeg brought the ancient instrument under full control. In the silence that followed, Throg looked around the chamber, at the skeletal warrior standing at attention, at Grucker's disciplined crew, at the wonders of human engineering that surrounded them. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful in a way Gruck had never heard before.
The humans did this? All of this?
The humans built this, Varric said, stepping forward with his sword sheathed and his hands empty. But they built it for the same reason your people fight. To protect what matters. To stand together against the dark. To leave something behind that's worth remembering. Throg was quiet for a long moment. Then he dropped his club, the sound echoing strangely in the vast space.
Teach me,
he said simply. Grucker smiled, not the fierce grin of a warrior, but something warmer and more complex. Teach us all. 6 months later, travelers on the mountain road between Grimjaw Canyon and the Screaming Hills began reporting strange sounds echoing from the peaks above. Not the howls of wind or the crack of avalanches, but something organized, rhythmic, almost like music, said the caravan master, scratching his grizzled head. Goblin music, if that ain't a contradiction in terms. But it wasn't a contradiction. From the ancient fortress that crowned the rust-bleeding mountains, the sound of disciplined voices could be heard for miles. Goblin voices raised in harmony, keeping time to the beat of properly tuned drums. Inside the fortress, rebuilt now, its bronze doors gleaming and its corridors alive with purposeful activity. Zeg stood before a classroom full of eager students. The instruments lining the walls were no longer museum pieces but working tools, each one maintained and mastered by goblins, who understood that music was just another form of engineering.
Remember,
he was saying, adjusting spectacles that he'd finally earned the right to wear.
The melody carries the message, but the rhythm carries the meaning. If you want your squad to feel left information, you don't just play the notes. You play them with conviction.
In the courtyard below, Grucker put her own students through their paces. The goblin warriors who drilled there bore little resemblance to the chaotic raiders who had once terrorized the mountain passes. They moved with precision, fought with purpose, and when they sang their marching songs, even the birds stopped to listen. Discipline isn't the enemy of strength, she called out, as her troops executed a complex maneuver that would have impressed human drill sergeants. It's strength with direction, strength with purpose, strength that lasts. At the head of the courtyard, a banner flew in the mountain wind, not the patched rag that Grucker's old crew had fought under, but something new, a standard that bore the symbols of two traditions, goblin and human, woven together into something that honored both while belonging fully to neither. General Varric stood beneath that banner, his skeletal form somehow more solid than it had been in the crypts below. The final choir had found new voices, and in teaching them, he had found new purpose. The song doesn't end, he had told them in those final moments before his form began to fade. It just gets passed on. He'd been wrong about the fading part. The dead general remained, bound now not by ancient duty, but by new purpose. The final choir lived again, and as long as it continued to sing, Marcus Varick would remain to guide its voice. From the fortress gates, the sound of marching feet announced the return of a patrol. But these weren't raiders coming home from pillaging. These were peacekeepers, goblins who ventured out into the world to settle disputes, protect trade routes, and demonstrate that strength and honor weren't mutually exclusive concepts. They marched in perfect formation, their voices raised in a traveling song that spoke of home and duty, of bonds forged in common purpose. At their head rode Throg, his massive frame somehow dignified by proper armor and disciplined bearing. "Report," called Gruck as the patrol approached.
"Merchant caravan ambushed in dreadful pass," Throg replied, his voice carrying the crisp precision of a professional soldier. "Bandits scattered, cargo recovered, traders safely escorted to their destination. No casualties on our side."
"And the bandits?" Throg's smile showed teeth that were still filed, but now gleamed with pride rather than menace.
"Let's just say they're very interested in learning more about our recruitment policies."
Grucker nodded approvingly. The mountain fortress had become more than a stronghold. It was a school, a embassy, and a symbol all rolled into one. Goblins came from across the known world to learn the disciplines of the final choir, and most left as better warriors and better people than they'd arrived. But perhaps most importantly, they left with songs. The melodies spread like wildfire through goblin communities, carrying with them new ideas about cooperation, discipline, and the power of standing together. Trade routes that had been plagued by raiders for generations suddenly became safe. Tribal conflicts that had raged for decades were resolved through negotiation rather than bloodshed. The chaos that had defined goblin society for millennia slowly gave way to something approaching civilization. And at the heart of it all, in a mountain fortress where the dead taught the living and music was the strongest weapon of all, the final choir sang on.
"You know,"
Zeg said to Grucker, one evening as they stood on the battlements, watching the sun set over the world they were helping to change,
"I don't think the humans ever really died."
Grucker raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Zeg gestured toward the courtyard below, where young goblins were practicing formation drills while their instructors called out corrections in voices that carried both goblin pragmatism and human precision.
"They left something behind. Not just weapons or buildings, but ideas, ways of thinking, ways of being."
"And now those ideas live in us," Grucker mused.
"Exactly."
Zeg adjusted his spectacles, a habit he developed when deep in thought.
"We're not trying to become human. We're becoming something new. Something that honors what they were, while remaining true to what we are."
From the fortress below came the sound of evening songs, goblin voices raised in harmonies that would have made the original final choir proud. The melody spoke of home and family, of duty and honor, of the bonds that held communities together and the courage required to build something lasting. "The song doesn't end," Grucker said quietly, echoing Varick's words.
"No,"
Zeg agreed.
"It just finds new voices to carry it forward."
And in the gathering darkness, with stars beginning to appear above the mountain peaks, the newest chapter of the final choir story continued to unfold. It was a story of redemption and transformation, of the way that good ideas could transcend the boundaries of species and circumstance. But most of all, it was a story about the power of harmony, The strength that came not from individual prowess, but from voices raised together in common cause.